My guest for February is Anthony, the presence behind Twin Peaks Grammar on Twitter and YouTube, as well as Instagram and other podcast platforms. On Twitter, he's a ubiquitous presence wherever the show is being discussed, asking questions and teasing out implications from other commentators, as well as taking his own unique analytical approach to diagramming things that Twin Peaks characters, creators, and commentators say, something he picked up from his own work as an English teacher. The point, as he'll explain, is to break down sentences to their communicative DNA, which part is referring to which other part. This, of course, can apply to the larger Twin Peaks narrative as well. On his YouTube channel, TP Grammar, Anthony has just begun hosting his own Twin Peaks conversations, so far with the guests who have also been on my show, Cameron Cloutier to discuss the in-the-weeds process of making his epic film, Queen of Hearts, and John Bernardi and John Thorne, in this case together, to let their own theories bounce off of one another, as well as take the ring and frame into focus. This is where Anthony, who is quite humble and gracious about his own contributions to the community, finds his strength as something of a coordinator and a conductor whose own ideas are drawn out in relation to others. My own podcasts in this series are always conversations, but we're going to take a particularly unique approach here. At a certain point, largely in the back part of this conversation, available as always to patrons of patreon.com/lostinthemovies on the $5 a month tier, Anthony is going to ask me a series of questions, which I will answer both in very short form, timing myself to the minute, and in very, very long tangential fashion, which is why I ended up limiting myself in a lightning round in the other cases. It's a true back and forth. This first public part will focus largely on Anthony's own approach, as well as my fascination with how he became a fan, discovering the entire series all at once, barely a couple years ago in the fall of 2020. What's it like to enter this world with the return already behind you, with all of the behind-the-scenes drama, new releases, and fan analysis already in the past? We'll get to that in a moment. But first, a quick update on my own work. My written Twin Peaks character series continues every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday on lostinthemovies.com. Since the last update, I've covered numbers 77 through 70. On Patreon, available at all tiers, I've so far advanced the entries for number 69 through 46. These previews will always be at least a month ahead of the public releases. I also published my last regular Patreon podcast, an enterprise that has been going since 2018, with roundups on what I've been watching, listening to, and hearing from listeners. But that's concluded now. This belated January episode also wraps up the Decade series going since August, where I provide capsules and a few longer film and focus reviews of films from different eras. I began back then with the 80s and moved in both directions. So this month I dove into a few films from the 50s and a ton of films from the 2010s. My two films in focus were All That Heaven Allows and a long discussion of Under the Skin, including comparisons with the novel that unusual sci-fi film was based on. As for public podcast, my most recent episode of Twin Peaks Cinema connects Lynch's first long-form work, Eraserhead, to his most recent, Twin Peaks The Return, as well as to older Twin Peaks, a subject that I've been exploring since my first video essay on Lynch's work prior to Journey Through Twin Peaks back in 2014, which I discussed with Anthony at one point in this podcast, and also happened to share as my video essay clip of the week on Twitter recently. Also on Twitter, I'm tweeting out threads of work on a particular episode on the anniversary of when that episode takes place, particularly relevant this year since days of the week as well as dates match up. For example, February 24th, the day that Cooper comes to town in the pilot, was a Friday in 1989 and is a Friday again now in 2023. Coincidentally, Anthony and I also recorded on that evening, known as Twin Peaks Day in the fan community. Here's what he had to say. So this is my first conversation with Anthony in a recorded format, but we've talked a lot online. He has started an account on Twitter called Twin Peaks Grammar, as I've described in the intro, but I'm going to let him explain both the Twitter work he's doing, the YouTube work he's doing, and just in general, his kind of approach to Twin Peaks. So Anthony, tell us, what is Twin Peaks Grammar and why did you choose to go under that moniker?
Okay, thank you. Well, first of all, thank you so much for asking me to chat. It's a real pleasure talking with you, Joel. I've listened to your voice for quite a while, and I really I admire what you do, particularly as not only, but as an interviewer in particular. I think you're the best in the business as far as like this Twin Peaks thing goes.
Well,
So
thank
I
you. That's very
appreciate that.
kind.
Yeah. So I was really looking, although I was extremely nervous and wondering like why the hell you'd want to talk to me. Um,
Well, I think we'll all find out in a moment.
I was excited to do this, and I thought it would be a lot of fun because, I'm going to let you steer the ship. But the grammar thing is, I'm currently a middle school English teacher, former high school teacher, and we were asked in my school to sort of elevate our grammar instruction a little bit. So I wanted to kind of make sure that I had no gaps in my own knowledge because, my own grammar learning was a long, long time ago. And I guess the approach that appealed to me most and I thought was most thorough was like a sentence diagramming approach. So, which I think a lot of people frown at when they hear that. So, long story short, that's kind of the main approach to grammar teaching that I used. And while I was using other people's sentences and other people's materials for a while, I wanted to create my own. And I ended up creating a grammar course mainly on diagramming, but with some other things as well. And that meant I had to create all my own model sentences. And I was coincidentally like falling deeply in love with Twin Peaks at the same time. So I figured I'd kill two birds with one stone, and almost all the sentences are Twin Peaks related in that course. Either like things said by characters in the show or by like the staff in interviews. But then over time, it became mainly by fans and I guess writers and just appreciators of the show. So whenever I see an interesting sentence, I think to myself that would be nice to pull out and diagram. I know it's a weird thing to say, but and then I just went on Twitter and just kind of said, let me share one or two of these, and I had to come up with a Twitter tag, and Twin Peaks grammar was it. So
So,
I guess that's the short version.
well, I'm going to ask you for another short version of something in a second, but basically, for those of us who are who know less about grammar than maybe we did in middle school, or maybe even ever did, or maybe less than your students do, can you explain? And I'm going to have some pictures up on here as well, over our discussion. But can you explain real quick, like a 1 or 2 minute summary of what this sort of grammatical diagram is, and also, well, we'll get to the Twin Peaks stuff in a moment, but
Okay, sure.
the purpose of it and the history of it and all that.
Sure. I'm not sure how much I could tell you about the history, although that is interesting to look into. I don't have that at the tip of my tongue. Um, one thing it does, in some way, it's almost like an artificial intelligence like hack to language to some extent, because it is an analysis of how language actually works, at least in English, and how sentences are built. So every part of a sentence is pretty much answering a question about another part in the sentence. So this is just a type of analysis that shows the relationships between parts. And typically you'll start by trying to find the subject and the main verb. And if you could find the subject and the verb, you can then ask questions about both of those things. And the answers to those questions are things like adjectives or adverbs, or sometimes direct objects. I won't go into depth. um, and that's kind of it. It's just a way to see how language interacts with itself within a sentence. And I guess one of the practical benefits is when you get a little more advanced in your reading and writing, um, people struggle when the language is a little bit higher level, and that's often because they can't identify um, all the modifiers and clauses that are telling us more information about the subject or verb. So on one hand, it does improve your reading and writing, and on the other hand, it's just I guess it's a way to exercise the analytical brain, because it's a like Twin Peaks to some extent. It's asking and answering questions and like putting puzzles together. Except unlike Twin Peaks, there are usually definitive answers.
That is, yeah, that's fascinating. I can see the kind of, beyond just using Twin Peaks sentences as like a convenient kind of vehicle, or using the grammatical structure as kind of a vehicle for that. Uh, that also seems like there's some sort of interesting parallels between Twin Peaks's narrative structure And this sort of approach to, and I suppose you could say that of anything's narrative structure, but I think Twin Peaks in particular, when you talk about complex works where people are sort of unable to, I like there's something there that the sentence is referring to, or this part of the sentence, and they're not quite, getting it, and so they feel lost. I feel like there's a strong similarity there to Lynch and Peaks in the sense that often people will dismiss the work as being self-indulgent or about nothing or just sort of random dissociated images, but the
Mm,
more you dig into Lynch, you always, or many people come away feeling like, no, there is actually a strong order beneath all of this that is kind of guiding it, even as spontaneous and improvisational as he is. Now, do you see that
mm,
kind of meta similarity there, or is that something you're, because I know you're sort of new to Twin Peaks, which we'll start about in
yeah.
a second. Is that something that you feel like you're at the outset of exploring, or is that something that kind of drew you to the combination of Twin Peaks and this kind of, I would almost call it, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's almost kind of like a dialectical approach to language.
That's wow, that's a really interesting way to put things. And I love the way that you use the expression like at the outset of this way of thinking, because I would say that's true. And on a side note, one of my favorite quotations, which I'm gonna just paraphrase, is when you learn a word, you are not that's the beginning of your understanding of the word, not the end. Like when you learn the definition of a word,
Mhm.
because over time, our definitions and our understandings deepen. And I would say that's similar to what you were just suggesting. I had not consciously or deliberately thought of like analyzing any of the structure of Twin Peaks in this way. But when you mention it, I'm thinking of people whose work I really admire, or even whose off the cuff thinking I really admire, and I see that they're often doing just what you said.
Mm.
So for me, it doesn't go as deep as that, but because I'm not really so good at analyzing Twin Peaks, and maybe part of the appeal of the like sentence diagramming is like it's like maybe like a miniature success. Like I could interact with the show and have like a moment of success.
Yeah,
Um,
on like the micro level. But
yeah,
it's
yeah.
interesting though, because I do feel like one of the reasons I wanted to have you on is that you're an interesting questioner and you have a kind of Socratic approach to Twin Peaks. Like that's how I feel like or you sort of engaged with me first.
Mm,
Now, how I see you engaging with John Thorne and others. And on your YouTube show, you do it very directly, where because I think the combination of the fact that you have this mindset where you're looking for sort of, it's like connections in a way, maybe more
mhm.
than answers, if that makes sense. I mean,
Yes.
the answers you get through the connections rather than just sort of, and one of the problems I sometimes have with some Twin Peaks analysis is I feel like there's a leap to a sort of a conclusion or some sort of thesis where they're not. I feel like with Lynch, the process of getting to that point is so important. And sometimes it feels a little like some of the readings sometimes feel a little imposed upon the work rather than
Yeah.
teased out from it, which is one thing I always loved about John Thorne's work. And I think Martha Nachemson may be one of the premium examples of this, where it's like you kind of follow the work
Mm,
and you don't set out with like this is the reading and it's gonna lead. You kind of follow the work and you feel your way to what it is. Like there's a great quote of that she gives in her first book where she's with David Lynch at an art gallery and they're looking at a piece of abstract art and she says, I don't get it, and he says, you do get it because your eyes are moving.
mm.
Which I love. But like there is that sense that because you are trying to figure this out, you're not coming to it necessarily with like a, you have a reading that you want to get from it. You're asking questions which are kind of interesting and illustrating the process, and I think encouraging people who are already doing that to do so more.
Yeah. Oh, I appreciate that. The only thesis that I have, I guess, since you brought up that word, I hadn't thought about it before, is that like I'm a little too stupid for figuring out this show. So I'm happy to just sort of maybe play point guard now and then, and try to pass the ball to anybody who wants to grab it. So I think one of the things that I enjoy doing is just randomly tossing questions out into the world and to see if anybody wants to bite. I have no idea if how often people see them or not, but usually those questions are triggered by something I had just read that's Twin Peaks related, or something that I was listening to in the car, a YouTube thing or a
Hmm.
podcast or whatnot. So that part is pretty fun for me because it's like, I guess you're in the mix of some sort of bigger conversation, and you just kind of like, I don't know, passing the ball to somebody else. And I'm not sure if that's like the teacher in me, but I am not I'm not trying to be like what's the word? That's not an act. Like I'm not smart enough to get to understand this show. So I really am attracted to people who have things to say, and particularly who have I guess some humility in their approach. You can't always like tell, but somehow that comes through a little bit. So that's always attractive to me. And I think when I first made connections with, I guess, some of the people whose work I read or listened to, was I started asking questions on Twitter about the concept of analysis, because in my class, it's an English class. We do, middle school level analysis, sometimes high school level analysis, but that is a word, and that's a concept that is, it's extremely deep. And Twin Peaks, for whatever reason, or maybe it's an obvious reason, draws people who have just like a really interesting analytical skill set. And sometimes I like trying to get people to unpack it, and maybe I could steal a tip or a trick here and there. But I think what I've learned, and very much from you, is it's probably more like just hard work over time. And I'm not calling this work per se, like drudgery, but people who've just, they've done a lot of reading, they've done a lot of writing, they try to transform their thoughts into writing extensively. Uh, I guess that's the tip. Like that's the trick that I've walked away with. Not like, not some sort of hack. It's just people who just put a lot of time in, and see where their thoughts lead them. For some of these people, it's through the act of writing. Like John Thorne, who you just brought up, he said a couple of times that he has sometimes like written himself into a corner where he tries to write his way toward understanding. And those phrases are just really interesting to me. Like it's almost like the pencil doesn't lie, as an accountant
Mm.
might say.
Yeah, that's fascinating because I feel like for me it was more like there's definitely stuff discovered in the process, but I felt like sort of hurled into discussing Twin Peaks because of the sort of the feelings and the thoughts and things coming back to it. Like really, the my past at this point 9 years of Twin Peaks work
Mm,
was born out of like a revisiting of the show about 5 years after I had watched it for the first time, and I'd done a little bit then. I'd written an episode guide and I'd watched it a couple times, but I moved on to a lot of other stuff and
yeah.
it lay sort of dormant for a while. And then when I revisited it in the spring of 2014, it became all consuming. And I had to write and make videos and do all of that. So for me,
Can you
the
can you can you tell me like just a little bit about that all consuming thing? Like what it was like for you, or
yes,
or
well,
like
let's
or
get to
what
that.
is it? Or what is it? What is this all consuming thing that so many of us have experienced?
I'm going to come back to that. Actually, I'm going to
Okay,
put a pin in
sure.
it
Yeah,
because I want to ask you first.
got it.
Your like what was it that drew, because I am fascinated by, there's a few groups of viewers who particularly fascinate me, and they're often the ones that I'm not. I mean, because I know
Mm,
my own way into the series. I've been fascinated for a while. Maybe I wouldn't say less so now, but I've sort of consumed enough of it to sort of feel like I have a grasp on it. The people who watched it when it was first on. I mean, that was the first group of people that I was fascinated with
yeah.
because I came to it in 2008 with gold box DVDs. It was you know, far in the past at that point, and there was this whole sort of, I would say, like Gen X quadrant. Like I was a little younger, people who were then, I guess, in their 30s. Now they'd probably be closer to 50, but people who had like watched it as teenagers for the
Hmm.
most part, and they knew the sort of process of watching it week to week and waiting for this or that and waiting a year for the film and all of that process. And this was of course before the return, so I had no context for that type of
Yeah.
viewing at all. And then that gave me a little more. Now I would say the people who fascinate me most are the ones who saw Fire Walk with me before the series. That's a
Hmm.
constant. That's always fascinated me since the first time I saw it after the series, but felt
Yeah.
like in a weird way I was pulling the curtain back and like retreating to a further part of my like unconscious or something that like knew this movie before the series. There was like something almost mystical about it. That it felt like it preceded everything, even though I was seeing it after. So I'm fascinated by people who actually did see, who did precede it for. And then finally, this is the group that you're in, and I'll sort of metaphorically pass the microphone to you at this point.
Yeah.
The people who came to it after the return. So people for whom it was a complete thing, for whom the return was not like this grand climax of the fandom, but something that like precedes their even getting into it. So as I understand it, you came to it in the past few years. It was
Hmm.
all of that. Um, what was your impression of Twin Peaks before you got into it, and what and how did you eventually watch it?
I started in, I think it was September 2020. I could probably tell you the exact date because after watching 1.5 episodes, I went onto Facebook, which I rarely used, and I proclaimed I proclaimed this is the greatest thing I've ever seen in my life after 1.5 episodes. And then I came back, I think after 4.5 episodes, like I had to stop watching it just to type this. I said it is confirmed, it's official. So that was it. I mean, so I was like hooked from minute one. Um, I didn't have too much of an impression before that somehow. I assume that probably most of my friends that I went to college with back in geez, like 94, 95, um, they were probably all into it.
Hmm.
But it really never came up because that was kind of like their personality type. They're probably like into Twin Peaks and etc. Like the surrounding, I don't know, pieces of art that might go hand in hand. Um, but then it was never even on my radar. I never heard of the return. So how do you like that? I didn't know it existed. I didn't know it existed.
So what
So
had you seen David Lynch films at all, or
the Straight Story, which I loved.
how is it? Okay. Yeah, that's a
Yeah.
fascinating context.
Yep.
There are
Yep.
definitely some Twin Peaks connections there, I think.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I absolutely love that movie. My father's a disabled Vietnam vet and a great guy. And there's a scene at the bar in that
Yeah.
movie that you might recall, and
Oh yeah.
that that's for real. Yeah, that's a real scene.
Yeah, that's such a great movie. Um, so that is an interesting context to come into Twin Peaks though. With did you know that he was known as like a surrealist director and all of that? Like, did you have a kind of an ambient sense of what he was about from like social media or anything like that? Or
Yes, yeah, that's a good way to say it. I kind of had the gist, in my own
Mhm.
way, but I didn't have this sense that he's the weird guy who does weird things. Not at all. I mean, I assumed he was good, if not great. I assumed he was important. I don't know. Maybe I have a good radar for who's wacky just to be wacky and who's got some substance. Probably not, but I knew there was something there.
Yeah.
I had of course heard of Elephant Man, but I didn't watch it. I probably heard of Blue Velvet. Um, but I kind of did the whole whirlwind thing, like the whole Lynch verse and kind of Fast and Furious, but Twin Peaks is pretty much usually where I'm at.
How far or how long was it between watching the pilot and watching part 18 of The Return for
Maybe two
you?
weeks,
Wow.
maybe a
Wow.
week, probably not a week. Listen, this was
Yeah,
during this was during
it
COVID.
was. Yeah.
Okay, so I was teaching in my a little nook in my bedroom
Mm,
while my
yeah.
kids were while my kids, at least for like 2 months, they were taking school downstairs, with my wife and
Yeah.
online. So it was pretty weird. And like the first couple months of the pandemic, which I guess no, I guess if I started in September, I guess it was further in. Yeah, I was doing real teaching because the first couple months it was just like I don't know, give them some stuff to do
Yeah.
and let everybody like take care of their families.
But you were doing real teaching virtually for that
Yes,
school year,
yeah,
2020 to 21. Okay.
yeah, which meant I had a lot of time,
Yeah.
and I'm not sure if it was like Netflix or whatnot, but I ended up finding something, and I watched the pilot, and that was like it, like from like minute one, honestly. And then I used my public library to get everything.
Right.
That's where I got the film.
Yeah.
That's where I got season two, I think. That's where I got the return. So
So that's amazing. A week or two. And then what was the process after that? Well, first of all, when did you go right into Lynch movies from there? Because you said you did that pretty fast and furious as well. Like, did you watch those right after you finished the series?
yeah, I think so. And I said to myself, I said, don't become like one of these weirdo people that has to do this. You don't have to
Yeah.
do this, Anthony. But
Yeah.
but I was just compelled.
It's the best kind of have to do it. It's
Yeah,
the
yeah, yeah,
like
exactly.
something is compelling you. You're not like forcing yourself.
Nothing was forcing me. Yeah, and I was compelled. And I did watch a fair amount of probably probably season two, like at night in my living room. And I live kind of in the woods, sort of. Well,
Oh,
it's
cool.
kind of
Yeah.
not deep in the woods, but there's woods right across the street
Yeah.
from. It's scary enough, trust me. And I was really like really scared at the Bob stuff, especially, and the owl stuff.
Mm.
And my wife, I didn't realize like she has like owls everywhere, just because that's like she's into design and stuff. Not for any like supernatural reason, but then I
Right.
started seeing them everywhere I turned my head. And it was the middle of the night. I'm watching this stuff, and if I had to go into the restroom, I like would avoid looking into the mirror. It was horrible, but great.
How soon after the Peaks and the Lynch and all that? How soon after like your solo viewing experience? Because it sounds like you weren't even watching it necessarily with your wife or anybody else.
No,
It was
myself.
like basically alone, sitting there at night with the TV in the woods and the owls and all that. When did it become something? I know you said you went on Facebook right away and said this is the greatest thing ever. When did you start to communicate with people online, or even not even necessarily communicate, but like read people or view people or start to hear what other people had to say about it after you digested it alone? Almost sounds like all intact all at once, kind of.
Yeah, I don't know if I'm lying right now, to be honest, because I my memory is unreliable, and I think it's getting worse with age, but my memory about this era is really unreliable. I think I started reading like after the return, I think, but I could be wrong. Um, I remember the first podcast that I found was uh I think it's called Twin Peaks podcast with oh crap. I don't know.
Entertainment Weekly one, or
No,
there
no,
were
no,
two
no,
of them.
no. No, that one's great. It was with Rich somebody, and
Hmm.
I'll have to think about it.
Okay.
They
Yeah,
were
there
they
was
were cool.
one.
They were just like casual, they were casual. They weren't taking too much of like like too much of a scholarly approach. It was more like a fan approach. It was great.
Mhm.
And and Idle Opus something or other.
Idle Thumbs.
No, no, this
Oh.
was a website. This is like
Hmm.
a Idle Opus something. But anyway, this was somebody who like broke down every single episode of The Return, like shot by shot. It was crazy. And then I realized that like a bunch of people do that. So then I'm like, oh, okay, this is interesting because I'm certainly not alone. This person is not alone. These podcasters are not alone. And then all of a sudden, like, the world of people who are interested and or obsessed with this starts showing itself to you. Um, and then I'm not 100% sure when I started putting things on Twitter. Um, I didn't really have any objective, but I think the first person to follow me was George Griffith. So that
Oh,
was super
cool. Yeah.
cool.
Ray Monroe himself.
Yeah, man. So that was like, I'm like, okay, this maybe this will be fun because I had no one to talk to. but I did ask my wife if she would watch it with me, and we watched the entire thing together, and that was awesome.
Did
That was
she
awesome.
did she I take it she liked it if you watched the whole thing together, I
Yeah,
hope,
yeah,
for
she
her
did.
sake. Were there reactions of hers? I guess this is kind of a echo question because first I want to know were there reactions of hers that kind of surprised you, made you look at it differently, especially being there physically watching it with someone and seeing how they responded,
Yeah.
A. And then B, when you've addressed that, what were you most well, let's save that one. Let's talk about your wife watching it with you first.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, she has these great takes that just I don't know, they just like just fall off her tongue, that I never think about in life and in Twin Peaks and in general. And so like watching the first show, watching the pilot, she's like, "Why are we watching this druggy show?" And she's like, "Okay," she's like, "Oh, okay, I get it. It's supposed to feel like you're on drugs." And like I never thought of that even once.
Well, that and the fact there's drugs all over it as well
Yeah,
that
yeah.
people are taking.
And I'm like, "Oh, that's pretty cool." I got so right from the start, I guess, as she would do a little bit of running commentary. Mostly we would be quiet. Mostly we would watch it quietly. But that was cool because I got to see it from a different perspective, like almost every single episode. And then I just remember watching Gordon Cole with the French woman in the red dress drinking wine. And dude, we laughed. I mean, we had to pause. We laughed for like 30 minutes straight, like literally, like we could not stop laughing and then imitating that scene together. And so that was amazing because I liked the scene the first time, but watching it with her just made it like completely delightful.
Yeah.
Um, and then she had like some interesting takes, like Candy, Sandy, Mandy. She's like, oh, that's Hugh Hefner. What's that show called? The Girls Next Door.
Yeah, where he had the Playboy bunnies in the mansion or
Yeah, and I'm
the
like, that
different
never crossed
wives
my
or
mind.
something.
I'm like, I don't know, maybe, but it's
The
like,
harem.
yeah, never crossed my mind. So that's cool, and she's pretty hip. She's got like a lot of worldly knowledge, and I each of us can relate to certain elements of like the characters in that show. Um, so that's cool. So we could bring, like anybody else, you bring some of your personal stuff to it. And yeah, that was great watching it with her. I got one other friend to watch it. We didn't watch it together. We watched it separately. And I was convinced he was going to flip out as much as I did, but he liked it but didn't love it. And
Did it?
he's like a singing bowls like gong master. He's like kind of internationally known
Yeah.
in that
Oh wow.
scene. Yeah, so I thought he would really dig like a lot of the sound stuff, which he did.
Yeah.
But I couldn't really commiserate as much. So the people I could talk to are online mostly, and that's just yeah, I think a lot of people feel that way.
When you started following what people were saying, I'm sure you noticed there are like often a consensus on certain things or and you had come to it completely innocent, so to speak,
Hmm.
not with no preconceptions or anything like that. What were the things that surprised you most about how most people or the general kind of take on something was?
Yeah, I mean that's a great question. Some of the like white knighting Cooper stuff,
Yeah.
it didn't really strike me that way, but that seemed to be almost like sort of set in stone, and I'm still not sure if that's the deal because like end of season 2, episode
Yes.
29. Like, what's he supposed to do? Like
Yeah, that's a tough that to me, I almost feel like they did a if that was what they were going for, they did a better job in season 3 of communicating that.
mm,
Um I mean, I do think there's something interesting to tease out about Cooper in season 2, but I do feel like a lot of it is teasing it out. And it's almost in relation to other things like Firewalk with me that it kind of you can kind of come to an interpretation of Cooper of like maybe how he's misguided. But yeah, it's
yeah.
in terms of plot, they don't really give they don't really give him another option there of what he could have done.
And also in terms of I guess being a decent human being. Like your girl gets kidnapped, and taken into this weird place. What are you gonna do? Say, like, oh, that's a bummer, and not chase in there. Now I know it's not some random weird place because he was familiar with some of the workings, or at least he had speculations. But and then when he walks in, and you get the flashing lights, and the guy singing, in the little bit, like, come on, are you really supposed to have perfect courage in that situation? Like,
Yeah.
I mean, I would have
Well,
been like in a puddle at that point, probably.
yeah,
But
I think for me, what's interesting about the question of like what are Cooper's failures and where does he get lost and all that, it's not like a matter of like judgment exactly per se. It's more like he if he's stumbling, it's because he's not in the right kind of mind space in a way that it's not like he did something, he made a bad decision per se, as like he isn't ready for it somehow in a way that I think you could argue in Firewalk with Me, Laura kind of ends up being, but more because of it, it's in large part because of what's happened to her. Um, I
yeah,
don't know. It's interesting. It's that whole dynamic of like who and how are people sort of culpable in Twin Peaks? To what extent is it a matter of like morality versus almost just like a metaphysics, like you know, what stage of the cycle are you at, so to speak? Which is why I always feel like if there's going to be more Twin Peaks, it's somehow going to be Cooper's Firewalk with Me.
that's it.
Like
That's
that's where it could go from there. But
yeah, that's where my brain went as you were talking. Not that I was thinking more Twin Peaks, but yes, that's a story that is really interesting to ponder. And maybe his mistake, his imperfect courage, or his failure, or whatever it is, or his kidnapped soul, or whatever, whether he's screwing up or something is happening to him, maybe that was set in motion a long time ago, and the events inside the Red Room
yeah,
are sort of just the symptom, that's
oh
just
for
that,
sure, yeah,
but this was kicked into motion a long time ago. But I don't know. I mean, I guess you really have to be pretty special to go into that place and come out okay,
yeah.
because
Maybe Major Briggs, and even he, I guess in some ways didn't come out okay.
yeah, I mean, the sometimes just coming out, and I've been in a red room of my own, so to speak, and sometimes just coming out is enough.
Yeah.
But I don't know what perfect courage looks like. It's an interesting concept. I don't know if that's a phrase that is like actually signifying something else. Maybe the word courage is like, maybe I'm getting too hung up on those individual words, perfect and courage. Maybe that actually means something else that is either over my head or just like outside of my view. That's possible.
It's a
Because otherwise, I don't
very
I don't know what it means.
it's a very Frost concept as well. I almost feel like if Lynch was to write that scene, what he'd have Hawk say would be perfect. Almost, and this is something I feel like I'm leaning heavily on Martha Nachemson's reading of it for, but
Okay.
it'd almost be perfect curiosity,
Hmm.
if that makes sense. And that's not necessarily um, something I would say is the big contrast with Laura. Like she has perfect, but she's almost like forced to be curious in a way, like the circumstances of her life. And he's certainly a curious. I mean, he is an investigator, but what Nachemson writes about interestingly in her book, where she contrasts the two scenes in the Red Room. There's only two, which is amazing in the whole
Hmm.
first two seasons. In the
Oh my
first one,
God. that,
I
that is
know, isn't that
crazy.
wild?
Yeah, that's crazy.
In the first scene, he's very receptive. He's like there for whatever it has to tell him and bring him. He's approaching it through the dream. In the second one, because he's going in to chase Annie,
Hmm.
understandably, his concern is how do I get her out of here? And it's kind of the wrong way to enter and go about it because the Red Room is bringing you things. And if you're not receptive to them, they can almost materialize as antagonistic in a way that they wouldn't necessarily if you were kind of riding the wave more. And I think that's a big thing with Lynch and his sort of spirituality.
That's really
is
cool.
is this
Yeah.
idea. So and that's an interesting tension with Frost, who is much more dualist. There's the challenge that you overcome. He didn't write that episode, but I believe he wrote that part. It's,
Yeah,
you know,
yeah.
he didn't take credit for everything he put into the script. That one was written by Barry Pullman, but I mean, if nothing else, he told him, "Listen, this is the ethos of the mythology we're coming up with,
Right.
because that's 100% Mark Frost type language and thinking." Which is again something really interesting about the show to me, is that it has those two voices in tension. But I want to
Yes.
go back to the question, I guess, of your perception of the show and what
Hmm.
people said. One thing I'm always curious about, because people kind of naturally, I think I naturally kind of came to the consensus opinion before I knew it was the consensus opinion, and others are not, like they watch it and have their own impression and are like, wait, everyone else thought that. Is
Yeah.
the second season, basically the second half of the show, after the mystery is resolved, it gets into all the sort of silly stuff. It's more about what are the wacky things going on in the town. Did
Yeah.
that stuff work for you on a first viewing? And were you, if so, were you surprised to see that other people had more negative takes on it?
Yeah, I enjoyed it. I did enjoy it a lot. And now I remember that I must have read a little bit about it while I was watching, because
Mm,
I at least caught a peek of people saying, like the second half of the second season sucks. So I
yeah.
at least caught a peek of that. And I was too into, riding that wave. So I said I'm not I think that's when I stopped reading, actually.
Yeah.
So
That was
uh,
a sign.
yeah, 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 yeah. And I enjoyed it. And if you asked me to summarize it, I couldn't do it. Um, it doesn't have, like, deep roots inside me like other parts of the show do.
Hmm.
Um, I enjoyed it watching it a second time with my wife. Um, but yeah, I don't remember a lot of the details. So, and actually, John Bernardi's going through episode by episode on his podcast, and that's cool because he's like right around that point.
Yeah,
So
right. I
I'm
was just
actually,
listening
yeah,
to
I'm
that.
actually getting a lot of plot that I had forgotten about. So I'm kind of enjoying it again.
When you got to Firewalk with Me, were you surprised? I mean, first of all, did you know it was a prequel for starters before you saw it?
No,
So
no.
uh I assume you were somewhat surprised then. Like, what did it take some adjusting to, or did you feel like you were going along with the ride for that as well, like you did with season two? What was your first
Yep,
kind of impression with that?
that took some adjusting to, and I watched that. Right now, Joel, I'm sitting. I have like an outdoor shed that we converted into like a little office, and this is like really a little woodsy area where
Yeah.
where I'm sitting right now, and this is where I watched Fire Walk with Me. So I was like scared to death for parts of it.
Oh, I'm sure.
Because literally you could see like the full moon out the window here. Um, I didn't love it instantly. So here's another place where I kind of differed with, I guess, the consensus, so to speak.
I would say the
I,
new consensus.
okay,
It's not.
yeah, yeah,
We'll talk about that in a moment because it's interesting. But yeah,
yes.
keep going with that.
One of the things I didn't love. I've spent a lot of time working in restaurants, and I used to run a bar restaurant with my wife, and I've seen a lot of like drunken and stupidity behavior, and I'm like, I thought it was a little heavy-handed as far as dramatizing Laura
Hmm.
in the way that it was coming across. I'm like, yeah, all right, we get it. And over time, especially, I guess by the time I got to the end of the movie, I felt differently. And then certainly in subsequent rewatches, I think the movie's like freaking brilliant at this point. But I found her really annoying the first time I was watching it, and this was having already seen the whole first two seasons.
Right.
And I'm like, oh my god, enough.
Was there a gap at all in your sort of imagining of Laura from the series, where you never see her and it's this almost mythic off-screen presence, and then when you do meet her in the film, at least for the initial viewing, was that a part of it at all, or do you feel like that wasn't really a factor?
um, I don't think so. I don't think so. I just uh I'm not sure. Maybe there's like a certain like empathy deficiency that I had or something. But I mean, I've known like a lot of screwed up people, you know, and people people who've been through a lot of stuff, and and people who've gotten through a lot of stuff, and who were like assholes, you know, at times. But I thought she was taking it to like a really, I thought she was like a big time version of that. And so I thought it was like a little excessively dramatized. I don't feel that way anymore. Um, you know, I think her actions and reactions were commensurate with the story, with her situation. But I just found her a little annoying the first run through.
Now, out of curiosity, did you watch the missing pieces at all as part of this run through, or did you come back to that later, or where did that fit into all of this?
Uh, I think I probably watched like 75% of them on YouTube as soon as I could, like right after watching the movie.
Okay. So, like, in other words, you watched them before you got to the return for the most part.
Yeah.
Okay. And then when you got to the return,
Yes, definitely. Yes. Yes, definitely. I mean,
yeah.
and that stuff was just that stuff was just crazy.
Well, can you
No.
imagine there were people, and I made a whole post about this to like kind of like almost like Cooper with Leland on the floor guiding him into the light. I made a whole
Yeah.
post like guiding people who had accidentally watched the missing pieces, or like even, more extreme in my opinion, like this sort of like fan cut of like the missing pieces and the film that's like that I guess you could, justify. Although I don't love the idea of people not seeing the film as it was made first. Whatever they do after is fine. But
Yeah.
there were all these things floating around that people were like downloading as torrents and stuff, especially like right after the missing pieces came out, and they would watch the whole missing pieces and be like, "I feel like I just saw fragments of a film." Like,
Yeah.
well, you
Yeah. Can you
did.
imagine? That's
And
crazy.
I always kind of had a perverse take. I remember getting crap on a forum for it when the missing pieces first came out. And to qualify it, I don't recommend this. I wouldn't necessarily, well, I would say pretty definitively would not recommend this to first time viewers. But I was intrigued by the idea of watching the missing pieces before Firewalk with me as like a gateway, because I feel like in some ways they match. I talk about this in one of my videos. Like they kind of match the film and the series in a weird way. They're like a bridge between them. And I thought, well, that's an interesting, at least for like a rewatch, kind of
Mhm.
way of easing into the world of the film. Now, keep in mind, there was a two, let me see if I can actually do the math on this. It would be maybe 9 weeks that the missing pieces existed as a thing. It's crazy that it was that short of a time because
Yeah.
it feels like a whole era in itself. That the missing pieces existed as a thing in the fan community, and there was no prospect of a season three.
Yes.
And
It was like
then,
2 months, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
that's it. It was late
Incredible.
July 29th. I remember because I discovered weirdly year later that it was the, let me see if I can do 2008 to 2020. It was the 6th anniversary of when I had watched the Killers reveal for the first time, which I
Okay.
realized because I was looking at my Netflix history and I was just kind of, sometimes scrolling. Oh yeah, when did I? And then I realized like, oh my god, that was the night that I watched
Mhm.
that. And then I did the missing pieces that 6 years later on that same date. And then October, I think 3rd was when they tweeted out that Gum You Like is going to come back and stuff. Another synchronicity thing. I had posted the first part of Journey Through Twin Peaks the day before that happened.
Oh my gosh.
And
Yeah.
that was like after I had said, okay, I did my Twin Peaks work this year, spent several months on Lynch and Twin Peaks. I think I'm done. And then I was like,
Yep.
I can't stop. And I ended up making the Journey Through Twin Peaks. It's like the biggest Twin Peaks thing I'd done yet. And lo and
Yeah.
behold, as soon as I finish it, it's like something was just in the air that year. And we'll
Yeah,
talk
for
about that
sure.
when we get when I finally answer your question about the all consuming passion. But before we get there,
Yeah.
when you got to the return, what were the surprises there for you watching it for the first time? I'm talking about. Um, I mean, I assume, so you said you didn't know there was a return. Did you find out while you were watching Twin Peaks that there was
Yes.
more?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you thought it was just a 90s show when you tuned up the pilot.
Correct.
Do you remember where in the series you discovered there was a season three?
Probably, probably after watching the first 1.5 episodes. when I felt,
Okay.
when
When
I
you
felt
post it
compelled
online.
to tell anybody who will listen. And the only people who respond to me on Facebook are my two uncles. So
That's
that's
funny.
about it. Yeah.
So what if anything did you have in mind coming into season 3, and what surprised you about whatever expectations you had? Because we got this, keep in mind, for those of us who got into Twin Peaks before, we had years of like warming up to this thing.
Incredible. I
I
mean,
mean, years, because it was a long
years.
process. He
Yes.
walked away from it for a month or two. The originally it was supposed to come out in 2016. It came out in 2017. So there was literally, between announcement and release, over 2.5 years.
Yes. To
But
just,
you had a week or two apparently,
yeah,
and
maybe
and
less.
seamless from the end of the finale, or from the end of Firewalk with Me. Pretty much, I would assume within days you were watching the return.
Yes, and I know some, I know some people who think that that's disgusting, but that's how it happened.
How else are you going to do it in this day? You're not going to
Yeah,
like force
it is what
yourself
it
to
is.
wait.
Do you know that I've never binged anything else, by the way?
Interest. Wow,
Yeah,
that's really interesting.
that's because I don't. That's because I haven't really watched a lot of other things. Like
Yeah,
I'm not really too, I'm not really too well bred, I guess, in that regard. But yeah. So this was like the experience of binging one, and then the Twin Peaks uh tornado. So I didn't have like I wasn't like curious to see how Annie was, for instance.
right.
I didn't have a full understanding of Cooper's situation or predicament. I I you know
So was that confusing when you saw a different version of him show up? Were you like,
I was not confused, but I mean I didn't understand it. But
yeah,
no, I did get the concept that like that the Cooper who was brushing his teeth was a weird dude at
yeah,
minimum. Um, but I never read the like there's like a great wrapped in plastic article that walks through the entire
yeah?
closing sequence from season two, and has some interesting like theory and insight in there. I was not familiar with that, so I didn't quite fully understand it. Um, I didn't have any sort of like overriding like I don't know, theoretical framework or anything like that, or really even a viewpoint. I was just excited to watch it.
Did you
And
have, or I guess to add to that, well, finish what you were going to say first. I'll bring this in a second.
and 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 uh and the energy of the return was just oh man, very, very real. Very real. And seeing that lady, how, who could forget her name? Marjorie Green, right?
Right? Yeah, isn't that funny? That was
I
way
wonder what her
before
middle
she
name
was,
is. Yeah.
yeah, way before she was in office or anything.
Yeah. um just that whole thing with her, it was like, I'm like, okay, all right, they got their vibe back. It's very different, but they have their vibe back where you're
Yeah.
kind of watching this character for way too long. Um, and the okay, Sam and Tracy, when you were talking about Martha Nackhamson, and maybe this was your own take as well, as far as going into the Red Room, sort of maybe like child mind versus like
Hmm.
going in there like sort of stressed out or mission based.
Yeah.
While you were saying that, which was just very interesting, I was thinking about Sam and Tracy looking at that box, and um, I don't know. It's like it feels like it feels like that's in some ways that's the show telling us, and I'm not even saying this literally. It's like, okay, there's two ways to watch it,
Yeah.
and one of them's gonna blow your mind, and one of them's gonna like blow your head off. And it kind of made me think of what you were
Yeah.
saying about like the two red rooms things there.
Well, that's actually the perfect segue into what I was going to ask is, as you were watching stuff and having your own reactions, were there times where your mind kind of wandered, or maybe afterwards, to like, gee, I wonder how people watching this at the time or in a different way perceive this? Like, were there parts where you were like, oh, like with Dougie or something, or maybe even the end of part 18 where you were like kind of imagining whatever your own take was, oh, this is, other people must have, hated this part or loved this part or something. Like,
Yes. I was able to pick up on that, like the Dougie stuff in particular. I was able to pick up on how this must be driving people, absolutely through the wall. And I didn't quite have that experience. I mean, I was super curious. Every hint, every hint that Cooper was going to emerge, whatever that might mean, I actually don't know. But every hint was exciting. Um, but I didn't, I imagine waiting 25 years.
yeah.
Oh my God. Oh my God. And then you have to, I could see how people felt that way. Then you have to sit through this crap. But I didn't feel that way at all.
Yeah, Twin Peaks Unwrapped, there was like a running, it wasn't intended as a joke, but it became a running joke where like every week, I think Ben in particular would say, I think he came out, I think something, this thing that happened is what's going to bring him back. He's
Yeah.
going to be Cooper. When we come back to the next episode, he's going to be Cooper again. And it would go on and on. And finally, around like part 14, they basically gave up on
Yeah,
that.
exactly. Maybe, yeah, that's the thing. As soon as you give up, maybe you're gonna get some.
Exactly.
I actually have this idea that I don't think is true, but it's fun to think about that when they're sitting in Santino's and Cooper, Dougie, whatever we want to call him, hears Angelo Badalamenti, like he perks up. And I don't, because that's just like a weird scene, he's looking
That
off at the
well,
space shuttle.
it's funny you say that because a lot of people did have that response to it, but
Oh,
I feel
okay.
like it was almost more about the pie. Like people mentioned the music, but like for some reason it was him when he bit into the pie and he says, "Damn good pie."
Yeah.
It's like
Now the
even the
pie,
way he
yeah,
says it,
the pie
yeah,
cements it for sure. But the way that whole scene
yeah,
develops, I mean, that's the building of tension in that scene, and then the release is just, oh, it's
yeah,
incredible. But not, yeah, I was actually thinking like because I don't know if we hear a lot of Angelo Battle. We do, but I don't know if any of the characters actually hear. So I don't know. I was just imagining that it was actually like Angelo himself that he was responding to, which is silly, but I
yeah.
love
No,
that scene, man. That's like one of my favorite scenes.
there is something about that scene where he's like more tuned into it than the other people are.
I'm like itching to ask you to ask you a bunch of questions, but I'm
Yeah,
restraining
we're
myself.
gonna. What that's yeah. Yeah. Let's get to that part in a second. So
Yeah, of course.
basically,
You know what the question was going to be, and then don't
yeah,
answer it.
go no, go ahead. Yeah, let's
The,
ask it.
the
Maybe I'll
question was
start with this one and then we'll navigate to the other stuff.
the question was going to be something like if you and I were to just pick one scene, like one scene from the show
Hmm.
and watch it and then maybe like try to analyze it together, which is not a strength of mine and I think is a strength of yours. Like how might that go? So that was the question, but we don't have to discuss that
How
right now.
might that go in terms of, do you
In
think?
terms of how might the conversation go? What might we apply like sort of like a formal tool set? Like might we look at all these different elements individually and then see how they interact? Or would it just be kind of like riffing? Or I don't know.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I guess it could, my general, I mean, it depends, I guess, what the subject is, who the person is and stuff. I feel like I like riffing a lot sometimes with, like with podcasts that I do on my own, they've always sort of been, and this part we'll probably cut some of this part out because
Yeah.
actually I'm gonna mention something in a second. But um, like for me, there's been some part. I mean, there's the Lost in Twin Peaks podcasts are mostly scripted. The only parts that I'm sort of riffing are where I go down a list of the scenes organized in a certain way and then I
Right.
say my thoughts on them, but like all the other stuff, and you could tell, by the voice and everything, it's like when I'm talking about the production, when I'm talking, when I'm giving my like what's the thing on Laura Palmer, what's the thing on this, like that's all written out in like a freaking 40-page word talking. I'm
Yeah.
talking 40 pages for like each episode, if not
I
more. But like
I
it's
believe you.
absurd. The process of that whole thing is a whole story into itself. But
Yeah,
point being,
that's amazing.
with that it's very scripted, but like all my movie podcasts are
Mm.
just me riffing, sometimes with notes, sometimes like I'll watch something and it's like it's frustrating in a way. Like it can be freeing and it's also like it's so different from my writing in a way, because my writing is also kind of written, but I guess because I've been writing for, you know, starting when I was a little kid, like in
Yeah.
school and stuff. It's like you learn to write, and that was something that I was always kind of like had a strong interest in, and kind of could organize my thoughts in a certain way. And no background really like that in, I guess you'd call it radio or whatever, like monologuing into a
Right.
microphone
Yeah.
without a script. And so it's like, that process can be frustrating for me sometimes, because I'm like kind of swinging on from the vines, like moment to moment, you know. So anyways,
Yeah.
that's a very roundabout way to answer your
Yeah, but
question, but
sometimes you're
I feel
swinging.
like
Sometimes
it,
you're swinging with no net, and that
exactly.
that has an energy in itself.
It does, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And podcasting, most podcasts are two people, so it's like
Yeah.
funny, you know. I mean, I love some podcasts that are one person. I think most of them are fairly scripted. I think John sort of does it. I like he seems to be going from notes, but I would say he's doing it unscripted. That's the sense I get. At least it sort of reminds me, his sort of way of talking and conversing or whatever reminds me of, you know, my my way of doing it when I don't have like a script there.
Hmm.
And whereas like something like I don't know if you ever listened to it, but the Mike Duncan podcast Revolutions, that's like he's reading a book to you almost, which I love, you know.
I
But
see.
I've kind of dabbled in both of those, and so I feel like if we did like an analysis, you could almost sort of like pick your way, like maybe even two scenes, one of which it would be like you go into it with a certain like framework and a
Hmm.
structure of like hit this, that, and the other thing, sort of like,
Yeah.
you know, grammatical structure, whatever else. And then one where it's like just watch it and see what you think and kind of roll with it.
Yeah, that's really cool. I know that some people they get together online, especially during like the pandemic, and they'll get together and watch full episodes. And what I would want to do is like get together and watch like one scene
Yeah.
for like 2 hours.
Well, I mean, for my character series that I'm doing right now, I mean, talk another thing that's been years, and like I did that, the first edition of that, and it's still like all the way up to the top. I think it was top 20 at the time. Now it would be like top 30 with the addition of all the return characters. Like that was written before the return, in 2017. And then as soon as the return was over, I'm like, I can expand that series that was unfinished already and add the return characters. And I was like creating, like, I would drop the scenes with the characters into an editing timeline so I could see how much screen
Mhm.
time they had. And then basically it's like a character cut. And so I've had these sitting on the computer for years and years and years at this point. And I finally, in the past year, have kind of made some progress. It's funny because you can watch a, it's not like one scene, but it's like you're watching things through one character's point of view, you know?
The only thing I ever got feedback on Facebook, which like I said, it's mostly just like family and relatives, is when I posted Dougie at the slot machine. Because we're Italian from New Jersey, and
Yeah.
everybody likes to go to the casino.
Oh,
So
yeah.
so everybody reacted and related to that one.
That's funny.
Yeah.
I was watching a political show today, um, where they were talking about Joe Biden, how like he just sort of seemed to be. I mean, they were like Bernie guys like me, and sort of bemoaning, but also like marveling, almost like impressed at the fact it's like this guy always seems like he's about to fall off the cliff or whatever, and somehow he just want like he's literally Dougie Jones from season three, and
If
they
he
like
put
drop
the
the
green
reference in
jacket on,
there.
it would be pretty amazing. If he has anybody that working with him that is remotely hip, yeah, and if any of the
Yeah.
staff are listening,
So
just once, put the green jacket on.
So, Anthony, we're going to now navigate toward the back part of this conversation, which is going to be pretty freewheeling. I think we've already touched on a lot of different stuff. But in addition to further questions I have for you about the kind of structure of Twin Peaks as you see it, and your impressions as a recent viewer and learning more about the fan community and all of that. I know you've got some questions for me as well. So we're going to do a little, again, the Socratic thing. I guess that's not Socratic necessarily, but I think your method often is. We're going to ask some questions of each other and kind of see where that leads in terms of the general conversation. So Definitely, everybody, check out that part. But before we get to that, I just want you to give the listeners a sense of where they can find you online and your work. And let's start actually, because I know you just started this channel. It's only got a few views, and there's some
Mhm.
already fantastic material on. So I want to
Oh,
pump those
thanks.
up and get people over there. Tell them about your YouTube channel as well.
Okay, the YouTube channel I believe is called Twin Peaks Grammar, I think, or maybe it's called nope, it's called TP Grammar.
There you go.
And yeah, it has some nice stuff, I think. I've basically just tried to like learn from people I admire, I guess, and then just make it public. So if people enjoy listening to Twin Peaks content like I did, maybe you'll find some stuff there that you like. And uh this was, Joel, I was a little nervous when you asked me about tonight, and I'm super glad that we did it. But I was a little nervous because your guests have produced like serious work, and they've they've written a lot of words, and I have like diagrammed other people's words, and I'm good at over tweeting, and that's pretty much what I have contributed. So I didn't think I'd have too much to say, but I'm glad we did this on Twitter. You'll probably want to mute me for a while, but I think it's TP Grammar, or you could type in Twin Peaks Grammar, and you'll we could connect there. And I think oh, and then I have like audio only stuff. So the YouTube stuff is also like, I guess we'll call it a podcast, and I call that Artists Love Twin Peaks. So you could check that out if you'd like.
Is that on various podcasting platforms like Apple Podcasts?
Yeah, I go like through Anchor, but I think it like spreads itself
Yeah.
out to the
Right.
usual suspects.
Sounds good. All right. And then to kick us off in this second part, why don't we start with you asking me a question?
Do you think Diane initially was supposed to be there on the front steps along with Cooper and Laura or Carrie? You think Diane was supposed to be there as well?
Okay, we'll end the public session there, but there's nearly 2 hours of additional discussion to be found on Patreon for $5 a month. I answer that question that he just asked, and also others, ranging from the whimsical, comparing Irene's and Candy's service skills, to the very serious. Is Bob's relationship to Mr. C fair, considering how it works with other characters? And much, much more. There's a lightning round of Anthony asking me questions, more rounds of me asking him about his own perceptions, and finally, some very long semi monologues on my part as the final questions on the podcast encourage me to ponder the political or apolitical, cultural, and personal currents that carried me to Twin Peaks in 2014, among other subjects. So make sure you check out Anthony's work on his own YouTube channel and his Twitter account, and also the Patreon conclusion to this conversation. And thanks for listening.